From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Clinical Reviews, interviews and ideas about innovations in medicine, science, and clinical practice.
Welcome to this JAMA Clinical Review podcast. I am Dr. David Simel, JAMA Associate Editor and Professor Emeritus of Medicine at the Durham Veterans Affairs Medical Center and Duke University. In this podcast, we will be discussing heat-related illness in athletes. I'm joined today by Dr. Francis G. O'Connor, MD, MPH, who is the Medical Director of the Consortium for Health and Military Performance and a Professor of Military and Emergency Medicine at the Uniformed Services University in Bethesda, Maryland. Dr. O'Connor is the lead author of the JAMA Insight on Heat-Related Illness in Athletes, published in the July 24th issue of JAMA, just in time for the 2024 Paris Olympics, where endurance athletes such as marathon runners and cyclists might be competing in high heat. Dr. O'Connor, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Simel, for inviting me to participate in this podcast with JAMA.
So as we're recording this in mid-July, much of the United States has been under recent heat advisories. What is the decision process into issuing those heat advisories?
Well, thank you, David. And, before I get started, all my perspectives and opinions that I'm going to share in this podcast are mine alone, and I do not speak for the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the federal government. In addition, before talking about heat advisories, just a little perspective on heat and heat illness. In the United States, more people are killed annually by heat illness than any other weather hazard that we encounter. It's a big issue for us in the military. Heat injuries actually outnumber cold injuries by 10 to 1. And as I'm sure you're aware, David, made national news here recently with the Hajj in Saudi Arabia. There were over 1,300 heat stroke deaths, with many of the temperatures during the 7-day Hajj exceeding 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, with regards to your question, with regards to advisories from the National Weather Service, actually in Virginia this morning, I woke up to a weather warning. The National Weather Service issues watches or warnings. A watch comes when there's about 50% confidence of meeting the warning criteria, generally within about 36 to 48 hours before the event. And a warning is where the National Weather Service determines there's about an 80% confidence in the event occurrence, generally within about 24 to 36 hours again before the event. The general rule of thumb that the National Weather Service uses, although it is different regionally as it's issued, is that when the maximum heat index temperature, and this is really important, David, it relies on the heat index temperature, is expected to be 100 degrees or higher for at least 2 days, and the nighttime air temperature will not drop below 75 degrees. But again, these criteria vary across the country. But the big focus here is that they use a heat index.
In your Insight article, you mentioned the wet bulb globe measurement, and I thought that was insightful in the factors that relate to how we perceive heat. Could you tell us a little bit about the wet bulb globe?
Yeah, David, as you know, the article that we have for the JAMA Insight is focused on athletes. And for measuring heat stress in athletes and occupational laborers, most organizations use the wet bulb globe temperature as opposed to the heat index. The wet bulb globe temperature, as you mentioned, is distinctly different in measuring heat as a risk factor. It incorporates a number of different items to include temperature, humidity, wind speed, the sun angle, and cloud cover. There are actually 3 variables that go into the wet bulb globe temperature, which was designed back in the 50s for the military, for the United States Marine Corps. You've got the wet bulb, the black bulb, and the ambient temperature, and most of the weighting, 0.7 of the weighting, goes to the wet bulb, which is really a reflection of the humidity and the ability for evaporative heat loss to occur.
Well, what is the spectrum of mild heat-related symptoms to extreme heat illness?
When you exercise, David, there's a preferential redistribution of blood flow. It goes away from the splanchnic circulation to the exercising muscles. And as you exercise with these muscles, you generate considerable metabolic heat, and all this heat has to be dissipated. Critically important in interpreting and understanding the pathophysiology and all the heat-related illnesses that we see is that a huge percentage of the cardiac output not only is going to the exercise muscles, but it goes to the largest organ in the body, which is the skin, because that skin is where this redistribution occurs to facilitate conduction and evaporation. And this gradient between the environment and the skin is what really drives what's happening physiologically. The higher the ambient temperature when it's really hot outside, or the vapor pressure where it's really humid, the higher the needed skin blood flow, which can have a lot of consequences for the individual. So this redistribution of blood flow that occurs to the skin results in a very early relative hypovolemia for the individual, and this leads to some of the consequences we see with heat exhaustion, heat injury, and exertional heat stroke. This redistribution, this relative hypovolemia, contributes to some of the early signs and symptoms you see with heat exhaustion, which include fatigue, mild headache, nausea, and dizziness. As it progresses to a frank heat stroke, now we introduce some of the other factors that may be contributing in hypotheses in exertional heat stroke, which includes an endotoxemia from a leaky gut and a dysfunctional systemic inflammatory response. All of these really can contribute to this fulminant septic shock-like picture and a fulminant coagulopathic picture that you can see in people who are really sick with exertional heat illness.
Well, Fran, with the Olympics on the horizon, how are endurance athletes such as marathoners or race walkers or long-distance cyclists preparing for the heat?
So what our athletes are doing right now as they're preparing for the heat in France is they're leveraging acclimatization strategies. They're trying to create those chronic adaptations so that when they encounter the heat, they're going to be able to function. What they're going to be doing is leveraging acclimatization, upregulating the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, increasing intravascular volume so that they can sweat earlier. Sweat is going to be hypotonic so that they can keep lower core temperatures when they're exercising.
How often do they have to exercise in the heat to accomplish that?
In general, it's thought that you need 10 to 14 days to get these chronic adaptations to meet the criteria for acclimatization to be effective. You normally need 90 to 100 minutes in the heat. And at a minimum, you need to go out there, you need to be able to raise your temperature, you need to be able to induce sweating to get these adaptations so that you can properly acclimatize to the demands that you're going to need over in France.
So there are people who have jobs who just need to endure the heat, and there are endurance athletes who are going to push themselves during competition. During those events, how do they protect themselves in terms of hydration?
Well, it's another great question, in particular for occupational laborers who are out in the heat. We really want to leverage acclimatization strategies the first day of work for anybody exercising the heat and any period of extended absence. If someone's been sick or they've been ill, they really start from go and they need to reacclimatize. They can't get back with the other laborers at that particular time. Anybody who's in charge of an environment, we want to leverage shade for outdoor work sites. If there's an opportunity to schedule work earlier or later in the day to avoid maximal heat exposure, that's an advantage. In the military, we use work rest schedules, which can be very helpful in eliminating exertional heat illness. And obviously, you want to try to limit strenuous work, such as carrying heavy loads during periods that you may be looking at advisories with watches and warnings. With regards to hydration, one of the things we have, David, in the article is we call out the NATA 2017 article on hydration to prevent exertional heat illness. Used to be that there were very concrete recommendations in terms of how many ounces you need per hour or how many ounces you need to, or quarts to recover after a day. But the emphasis has really shifted away from numbers to the recognition of individualization of hydration strategies. And there's a big focus in that 2017 article that we cite about ad libitum. You want to enter a period of heat exposure where you're euhydrated, but after that it should be ad libitum because it's so multifactorial and individualized on the hydration that needs to be consumed. Highly multifactorial.
Does it matter whether you drink water, a flavored drink, a sports drink, or any of the products that are out there, or is it just drink?
General recommendations are if the event or activity is under 1 hour, water is absolutely fine, water alone. But if the event goes over 1 hour in duration, it's generally recommended that the fluid be supplemented with a carbohydrate and electrolyte solution, in particular events over 4 hours. But that's the general recommendation. Most importantly, it's got to be something that the athlete is going to consume. That's the single most important thing.
You emphasize that when a person has heat symptoms, you need to start rapid cooling. How do you do that?
So the most important thing is to leverage cooling with whatever you got, depending on the event. So removing someone from the heat into the shade, leveraging a stream, leveraging cold water, ice towels. Obviously, as we reiterate in our article, best practice is cold water immersion, but this may not always be practical. So we discuss a number of different methods in the article to include not only cold water immersion, but tarp-assisted cooling, ice water toweling, anything that you want to do, but anything that leverages changing that gradient is what you want to do, because by changing that gradient between the skin and the environment, we decrease the need for all that skin blood flow. And a lot of that blood flow is shunted immediately back into the systemic circulation to protect the heart and the brain. In many ways, David, this is truly a cardiovascular event, exertional heat illness.
It sounds like a lot of planning has to take place before a large-scale event, or else you're not prepared to cool a person. What type of planning goes into the Olympics or in the workplace towards being prepared to handle a heat event?
Yeah, what we discussed, David, in our article is the concept of the emergency action plan. And emergency action planning is really mandated at all sporting events, NCAA, high schools, and certainly at the Olympic Games over in Paris. I can guarantee you that teams are prepared with detailed emergency action plans. Each site has a specific plan based on an assessment of risk for exertional heat illness, and there'll be pre-positioning of cold water immersion tubs or other strategies, again, based on the assessment of risk. In addition to pre-positioning cold water immersion tubs and other strategies, the teams are well prepared. This is a heat attack. So these teams need to be prepared on what they're going to do. We want to, most importantly, treat on site and then evacuate. We don't want to put people in an ambulance and get them off to the hospital without cooling on site first. That's certainly one of the mantras for management of exertional heat illness in 2024.
Suppose you're a recreational athlete and about to go out and run a 10K or participate in a half marathon without the level of preparation like the Olympics. What should you expect from a local event?
I think the most important thing, David, is assessing your own individual risk. Like you said, your state of acclimatization. Take a look at that event. Is this unusual heat on that particular day, which may put you at risk? And then you're going to listen to your body and you're going to slow down. Usually, most races will have a published website and identify what medical resources may be available. Most races also on the back of a bib allow you to identify any medical problems or medical issues, medications that you may be using that you can write so that you can communicate to someone who may have to treat you if you're down. But I think the most important thing, David, is listening to your body. As you and I had talked about before, one of the keys that we see in the military right now and in the athletic population for exertional heat illness is overmotivation. People will push to get their personal record, to get that medal at the finish line. And sometimes you need to listen to your body and just slow down.
Well, Fran, I've enjoyed talking to you today. Is there anything else you would like our listeners to know about exertional heat illness?
Yeah, David, just a couple last things that I think are important that we did touch on in the article. Number one is individualized risk. We know there's nothing like American football that produces heat injuries. We got an epidemiology of nearly 4 per 1,000 events where you can sustain a heat stroke. But individualized risk, we now recognize the greatest risk in football is linemen. So linemen should not necessarily be performing the same activities as wide receivers, but recognizing those individuals at risk. The other thing, David, is, why is it that a soldier who's done fine for 10 years all of a sudden has a heat stroke on a particular day? We've come to learn that a very important risk factor is infection. So if you are ill, not feeling well, cold, diarrhea, sinusitis, anything like that, you need to recognize that infection may put you at risk for an exertional heat stroke, and you either are not going to participate that day or you're going to slow down. One of our big focuses at Uniformed Services University as well, David, is supplements. Supplements are rampant. The supplements that I'm most concerned about are pre-workout supplements that may be enhancing a sympathomimetic state. They may be stimulating, may be laden with caffeine products. These we need to be cautious with, as they may lead to problems in the heat. These may be contributory. They may mask some of the fatigue that you may sense. They all automatically may be stimulating your cardiovascular system, but to be very cautious with supplements moving into an event that you might be at risk for exertional heat illness. And my last point, David, I had already emphasized with you, is leadership, overmotivation. Very, very important that the coach, the trainer, and the individual athlete is paying attention to overmotivation, as this is a key risk factor for exertional heat illness.
Thank you, Dr. O'Connor, for joining us today to talk about heat-related illness. This episode was produced by Daniel Musisi at the JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com. Thanks for listening.